History is often told by the victors, but what if those victors wore suits instead of uniforms? What if wars were fought not on battlefields, but behind closed doors, through secret memos, paid mercenaries, and whispered phone calls? Between the 1950s and the 1980s, the CIA acted not as a mere intelligence agency, but as a global architect of regime change. Cloaked in Cold War justifications, it waged silent wars in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, Cuba, and beyond, not to protect democracy, but to preserve Western power. These were not isolated incidents, they were blueprints. Covert coups. Economic sabotage. Propaganda machines. Operations so secret that even Congress was left in the dark. And when secrets leaked, so did blood. Leaders were overthrown. Nations collapsed. Millions paid the price. In this documentary, we uncover 6 of the CIA's most consequential covert missions, stories buried in classified archives, shielded by patriotism, and dismissed as necessary evils. From betrayal at the heart of the agency to tunnels beneath Berlin's cold streets, we trace the hidden hand of imperial ambition masquerading as national security. This isn't just history. It's a reckoning. (1) Operation Ajax, Iran, 1953. In the dusty summer of 1953, the CIA executed one of its first and most infamous coups, Operation Ajax. Its target? Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a democratically elected leader who dared to nationalize his country's oil and challenge British and American control. The response was swift and brutal. Under orders from Washington and London, the CIA unleashed a campaign of propaganda, bribery, and street-level chaos. Iranian generals were paid off. Mobs were orchestrated. Newspapers were manipulated. And Mossadegh was toppled. The Shah of Iran, an authoritarian monarch, was reinstalled with Western backing, setting the stage for decades of oppression. This operation marked the birth of American regime change strategy, cloaked in Cold War paranoia but driven by oil and empire. It wasn't just a betrayal of Iranian democracy, it was a warning to the world: align with Western interests or face subversion. The seeds planted in 1953 eventually grew into the Islamic Revolution of 1979, igniting tensions that still burn today. Operation Ajax wasn't just a coup, it was an imperial blueprint disguised as diplomacy. 2. Operation Success, Guatemala, 1954. In 1954, the lush landscapes of Guatemala became the backdrop for a ruthless CIA coup codenamed Operation Success. The mission, to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz, who had introduced land reforms threatening the stranglehold of U.S. corporate giants like the United Fruit Company. Despite being elected through democratic means, Arbenz was branded a communist by Washington. The real motive? Profit and power. With CIA support, a ragtag rebel army was organized, psychological warfare was deployed, and a disinformation campaign saturated the airwaves. Arbenz, isolated and abandoned by his military, was forced to resign. What followed was a descent into darkness. U.S.-installed dictators ruled Guatemala with iron fists, unleashing decades of civil war, genocide against indigenous communities, and political repression. The CIA's involvement wasn't officially acknowledged for years, yet the scars are undeniable. Operation Success wasn't just about toppling a leader, it was about defending an imperial economic order. It exposed how easily democracy could be sacrificed at the altar of American corporate interest, and how foreign lands became chessboards in a game of capitalist conquest. 3. Project FUBELT, Chile, 1970 to 1973. Chile, 1970, a nation chooses socialism at the ballot box, electing Salvador Allende, Latin America's first Marxist president. But Washington had other plans. Under the cloak of secrecy, the CIA launched Project FUBELT to undermine Allende's government. They funded opposition media, encouraged labor strikes, and even plotted to kidnap a top general. The economic sabotage was relentless. Allende's vision of democratic socialism was poisoned from within. By 1973, the trap was set. On September 11, tanks rolled through Santiago. Fighter jets bombed the presidential palace. Allende died with rifle in hand, defending his mandate. What emerged was the brutal dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, a regime backed by the US and marked by torture, disappearances, and the dismantling of workers' rights. Chile became a neoliberal laboratory for American economists, while the CIA denied its fingerprints on the bloodied pages of history. Project FUBELT shows how fear of socialism morphed into imperial aggression, how democracy could be drowned by capital, and how Cold War paranoia left Latin America scarred. It wasn't just a coup, it was an experiment in authoritarian capitalism, orchestrated from Langley. For Operation 40, Cuba, 1960s. The 1960s saw a new frontier of espionage in the Caribbean. After Fidel Castro's revolution toppled the Batista regime, the U.S. elite panicked. Cuba had become a symbol of defiance, socialist, sovereign, and dangerously inspiring. The CIA responded by forming Operation 40, a clandestine group of Cuban exiles, spies, and hitmen. Their mission? To sabotage Castro's government through assassinations, bombings, and psychological warfare. From the failed Bay of Pigs invasion to secret attempts to poison Castro's cigars, Operation 40 was an obsession driven by humiliation and fear. But it wasn't just Cuba they targeted. The group's influence spilled over into Central America, helping enforce U.S. interests wherever rebellion brewed. Rumors persist that Operation 40's reach extended into the underworld of drug trafficking and domestic operations, its legacy murky and unresolved. These were not just warriors in the Cold War, they were ghosts of empire, operating outside the law. Operation 40 exemplified the blurred line between patriotism and terrorism when imperial power feels threatened. It was a mission that embodied paranoia and left a trail of destabilization across the hemisphere. 5. Aldrich Ames, the mole within. While the CIA waged war abroad, one of its greatest betrayals came from within. Aldrich Ames, a seasoned counterintelligence officer, began feeding secrets to the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. His motivations were as old as time, money, status, and disillusionment. But the consequences were catastrophic. Ames exposed dozens of CIA assets across Eastern Europe, many of whom were executed. These weren't just intelligence losses, they were human lives, sacrificed for greed. While the agency hunted for moles, Ames lived lavishly, flaunting his wealth in plain sight. Internal incompetence shielded him for nearly a decade. His eventual arrest in 1994 shook the intelligence community to its core. How could such a betrayal go unnoticed? What does it reveal about the vulnerabilities in a system built on secrecy and surveillance? The Ames case wasn't just a spy thriller, it was a tragic warning. It reminded the world that while espionage agencies fight external threats, the deadliest dangers often come from those within. In Ames, the CIA found not a hero or a villain, but a mirror reflecting its own moral rot and bureaucratic blindness. 6. Operation Gold, the Berlin Tunnel, 1950s. At the height of Cold War paranoia, the CIA and Britain's MI6 embarked on a daring scheme, Operation Gold. The idea was simple, yet bold: dig a tunnel into East Berlin to tap Soviet phone lines and eavesdrop on military communications. For 11 months, the tunnel snaked beneath communist territory in secret, a marvel of Cold War engineering. But there was a catch. Unbeknownst to the CIA, British double agent George Blake had already informed the Soviets. They allowed the operation to continue, feeding misinformation and biding their time. When they finally discovered the tunnel in 1956, the press was shocked, but the Soviets had already gained the upper hand. Operation Gold became a textbook case in espionage failure. Despite its ambition, it highlighted the limits of secrecy and the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated plans. It was not just a failure of intelligence, but a reminder that betrayal can render even the grandest schemes hollow. In the great game of shadows, one leak can flood the tunnel, and history remembers who let the water in. What binds these stories together is not just secrecy, but silence. A silence enforced by power. A silence bought with blood. The CIA's legacy of coups and covert operations between the 1950s and 1980s reshaped the political landscape of entire continents. Democracies were dismantled. Dictators were propped up. And all of it was done not with the consent of the people, but in the name of the American flag. These missions were justified as battles against communism, but in reality, they were battles for control over oil, land, ideology, and influence. And while some of these operations are now acknowledged in declassified files, many remain shrouded in ambiguity, hidden behind redacted documents and historical amnesia. But history doesn't forget. The consequences of these interventions still echo today, in the instability of regions, in the mistrust of governments, in the resistance of people who refuse to be pawns. To uncover this past is to confront uncomfortable truths. And that's precisely why it must be told. Because if we don't understand how power operates in the shadows, we risk repeating these shadows in the future, this time with new names, new wars, and new victims. The truth is uncomfortable. But silence is far more dangerous.